Hi everyone, and in this series of video lectures we're going to look at the self-attention learning mechanisms of transformers, showing that they are sufficiently flexible to allow them to adapt to modelling language, images, videos and even meshes and graphs. To do this we need to start by offering clear intuition for how self-attention works, looking in detail at each of the components to understand why every single one is necessary. In many contexts, it doesn't really matter what you're modelling. Deep contextual understanding requires knowing how distant parts of the data covary together to build up a picture or a scene. For example, if you take fiction, very often the context of a specific paragraph or chapter often references things that happened far back in the prose. Or if you consider this image of a dog, to know that the patch on its bottom is a Dalmatian, then you need to also have seen its head. So this is what self-attention supports and why the framework is so flexible. From this high-level intuition, we'll then go on to look at vision transformers. We'll also look at common tricks of the trade that can be used to improve the robustness and generalization of transformer frameworks, particularly because the self-attention operation is very parameter hungry, which increases computational complexity and puts you at risk of overfitting. So to address these two problems, we'll talk about self-supervised pre-training and hierarchical learning frameworks such as swing transformers. Finally, I'll touch briefly on how these tools have been further generalized for graph and mesh domains. Okay, so let's start with breaking down the self-attention operation to understand how it works and what all the components do. So we start with a set of tokens. These may come from word embeddings, or they could be image patches. So x1, x2, x3, these are vectors, and they are our tokens. They can represent anything. These tokens are first projected through a linear layer to reduce their token length to d. From these we generate three new matrices: the query, the key, and the value. These are generated by transforming each input token with a trainable weights matrix. We've got different weights for the query, the key, and the value. These weights have shape d by d, and the query, key, and value have shape d the same as the input token. So what this basically means is that every element of qi is generated from a weighted combination of all elements from the x token, with the weights provided by WQ. Same for the key, same for the value. Self-attention scores are then estimated from the dot product between the query and the key, where this is essentially some measure of the similarity between the query key projections of the samples xi and xj. So qi corresponds to xi and kj corresponds to xj. These scores are first normalized through dividing through by the square root of the length of the token, d. And then they're pushed through a softmax to change the outputs into a probability distribution, which can be interpreted as the probabilities of the key attending to the query. The final output then multiplies the attention weights with all of the values to decide which elements are carried through most strongly to the next layer. Okay, so what is self-attention? The attention mechanism is calculated from the dot product of the query and the key, where they themselves result from linear transforms of the input tokens, with these projections determined by their weights tensors WQ and WK. So visually you can think of it as telling us how aligned these vectors are in that transformed feature space. If they're parallel, meaning the vectors have similar feature distribution, then the dot product will be 1, and if they're perpendicular, then it will be 0. We know this since the dot product or cosine similarity is proportional to the angle between the vectors. So in summary, the attention is telling us how similar our query and key are. We might then say, why do we even need to learn weights? If we're just interested in the similarity between tokens, why don't we just calculate that directly? But then this would be a very shallow model of the data, since there would just be a single layer outputting one symmetric estimate of similarity that couldn't change or be updated through learning. So the query and the key are modeling the attention. What is the value for? The value is what we actually carry forward to the next layer of the network. So here yi shows that each new value for token I is formed from a weighted contribution of the values of all other tokens. So this is the matrix here, where the weights are calculated from the self-attention scores. One way to think of the value is to remember how things work for Python dictionaries, where this key, query, value terminology comes from. So in Python dictionaries, we associate each value with a specific key, such that if we then supply the correct query that exactly matches the key, then we can unlock the value associated with that key. Thus in transformers, if dot product aij is high, then this is going to unlock the corresponding value for that specific key, and that specific key is going to have a large contribution to the new value of the token I. So here we can just see this process in motion using a very simple 3-word sentence where each of the words correspond to a 4-dimensional embedding. So D here is 4. And we can see that the new tokens for the, dog, and ran are formed from a weighted combination of these 3 tokens from the previous layer. So you're just adding these vectors up as a weighted sum, and then you get a new token. Okay, so now we know the purpose of the value, and we know that we need some weights in order to learn different models of the sequence for different layers of our network. But why do we need weights for both the query and the key? This is so that we can learn asymmetric representations between tokens and words, where I found this perhaps easiest to understand in the context of language, partly because through reading this really excellent blog. So they state that the importance of words and the meaning of others is directional. For example, given the sentence, Evan's dog Riley is so hyper, she never stops moving, it's much more vital to know that the subject of the sentence is a dog than actually knowing the name of the dog. Thus, carrying forward the value of dog attending to Riley is much more important to sentence understanding than pushing forward knowledge of the name of the dog. Okay, finally, a few important implementational details. So firstly, normalization of the dot product by square root of d is crucial for maintaining the unit variance of attention values. Even if the original keys and queries are normalized, the dot product is multiplying and summing the contribution of each element, which are each one, which means that if this is summed to d times, then the variance of the dot product grows by a factor of d. Thus, to ensure that the variance of the tokens remains the same, we need to be able to scale variance back by a factor of 1 over d, which means that since the queries and keys are multiplying together, we need to divide each of them by a factor of 1 over square root of d, such that then the variance will sum to 1, otherwise the elements will quickly grow, pushing the softmax to 1 with gradients tending to 0. It's also important to understand that we're always doing this over multiple heads in parallel, which is why these layers are called multi-head self-attention or MHSA layers. So the motivation for doing this is that prose or dialogue or indeed image understanding is nuanced. So at any one time, there'll be many different levels of association to keep track of. So to do this, we split our token embeddings into segments within each layer to process them each with different heads in parallel. This then learns a different combination of attention weights for each head, and thus the queries, keys, and values for each head are different. The outputs are then recombined immediately after the attention calculation and before the data passes through a feed-forward neural network layer. And this process proceeds over many layers because whereas the multi-head self-attention is about looking at different types of relationships simultaneously, for example, grammar versus meaning, stacking multiple layers is about increasing the abstraction and the complexity of those learned relationships. So putting this all together, one block from the transformer encoder layer normalizes the inputs, segments the tokens, pushes these through the multi-head self-attention or MHSA operations, recombines, then pushes them through another layer norm to a lightweight MLP, which is wide, not deep, to support fast parallelizable execution. The network includes residual connections around the self-attention layers and the MLP, which, as we already know, makes it easier for the network to learn identity transforms to prevent gradient saturation. The primary purpose of the MLP is to provide position-wise nonlinear transformations to the output of the attention layers. While attention captures how tokens relate to each other, the MLP is where the model thinks about each token independently to refine its abstract representation. This MLP typically consists of two linear layers with activations in between, so the linear layers expand and then contract the feature space, and the activations are actually GALUs, not ReLUs, where the difference between these is that a ReLU essentially acts like a simple on-off switch, clamping all negative values to 0, whereas a GALU instead encodes a smoother probabilistic activation that allows for a small amount of negative information to pass through. The precise mathematical definition of a GALU uses the cumulative distribution function of a standard normal distribution. But because calculating a Gaussian integral is computationally expensive, developers usually use tanh or sigmoid-derived approximations. Okay, so for the self-attention operation, the computational operations involved are matrix multiplication of the queries and the keys, scaled by 1 over square root of d, where d is token length. This is passed through an element-wise softmax, and then a matrix multiplication is used to multiply the self-attention weights with the values. There can be an optional masking of elements, but this is mostly used in autoregressive models for language, and we don't need to worry about that here. Then for the multi-head self-attention, we need to split our query key and values from their combined input or output from the previous layer, such that subsequently each query key and value is split into these H heads, where the token length within each head is d over h. These are separately processed by scale dot product operations, and then the output of all of this is concatenated back together before the linear layer. So one key advantage of transformers is that they're inherently interpretable because we can visualize their attention weights. Before we look at this for vision in the next section, I think it's really helpful to look at how this works in the context of language, partly again because this BurtViz notebook is really helpful and offers these really lovely little GIFs to explain the process. So I really recommend spending 5 to 10 minutes going through this. So just looking at one example here, they're looking at two very simple sentences, and they're looking at the first head and the first layer of the transformer, so it's learning fairly simple relationships. We see that this particular head is mostly attending to words within a sentence, but it is learning that some combinations of words are more important, like the association between rabbit and hopped, so noun to verb. We can see that each head is learning a different relationship between words and in these two sentences, because we've got heads here and their associations are different. And we've got layers here. And we can see that most cases they're learning different things, but there is a degree of similarity, and I think that's just because the sentence problem here is particularly simple. It also might be of interest to know that some researchers are looking at how similar the encoding of transformers is to how the human brain processes stimuli. So in this particular example from Jean-Remy King at Meta in Paris, they passed audiobooks to the transformer, and they also played those to individuals in an MRI scanner and measured their functional MRI. And then what they did basically was they took the different layers of the transformer and they tried to take those activations and see how well they predicted the brain activity. And so you can see the prediction here and the ground truth. And in many cases, it was really quite good within the language regions. And what's more interesting is that the lower layers of the transformer are better at predicting the primary auditory areas, which are doing the most basic processing. So, perception of pitch, high or low tones, perception of loudness, and timbre. And then the deeper layers, as you get towards the end, better correlate with the higher order auditory regions of the brain that are responsible for high level processes such as grammar and context. Okay, So in conclusion for this section, the weights of a transformer are learning linear transforms that project inputs onto query, key, and value tokens. The query and the key are compared with each other to work out which embeddings are most similar to each other, and these weights are then normalized and pushed through a softmax. The outputs are multiplied with values which then create new embeddings for each token into which the value of other tokens gets incorporated with contributions defined through the self-attention weights. So in this sense, the value operation can be seen as what's carrying through the meaning to the next layers. Multiple heads are then being learnt or trained to model different types of relationships. For example, in a language transformer, different attention heads would specialise in capturing different linguistic patterns such as grammar, subject to verb agreement, co-reference, linking pronouns to nouns, and contextual meaning. These specializations emerge naturally during training as the most efficient way to reduce prediction error, allowing a model to know a word by its syntactic and semantic company. And we've seen that what they do learn is human interpretable, and moreover that it seems to align to some extent with how the human brain is coding language and vision in a hierarchical ways.